Great. Looks like this is all running, so I hope you can all see and hear me. Thank you very much for joining us today for today's talk about investigating local archaeology. My name's Nina O'Hare and I'm one of the Community Project Officers for Worcestershire Archive and Archaeology Service. So today's talk is aimed at anyone who's thinking of investigating a historic site or running an archaeological project in your local area. We're going to go through different archaeological techniques and key considerations when planning a project, so we hope you'll find this overview useful. If you've got any questions afterwards, please do just get in touch. Leave us a comment below or email us, and I'll give details for that at the end. So finally, just before we get started, just to say that there are some examples are Worcestershire based, but the information is applicable to elsewhere too, so this is relevant wherever you are based. So let's start at the very beginning. You've got an interesting, intriguing local mystery and you want to find out more about it. You might already have some ideas about how you're going to explore the mystery, or you might be looking for some inspiration and guidance. Generally speaking, most local kind of mysterious sites fall into two categories. One is a site that you're trying to find out more about. So it could be an earthwork that you're not quite sure what it's from, crop marks of a site, or perhaps a scatter of finds. The second is to locate a lost site. So somewhere that you've perhaps seen a historical reference to, or there's a local memory or kind of story about it, but you're not quite sure where that site was located, and you want to kind of pin that down. So you have your mystery, but where do you actually start? One of the first things to do is to set your aims. Have a really good think about what you want to find out or achieve. So is the aim to find out certain pieces of knowledge? So what date is this site? What is it? Where was the mill located? That sort of thing. Or is it something different, so perhaps bringing the local community together? If the aim of your site's to find out more about a site, try and pin down what you most want to know. So rather than simply saying you want to know more about a site, have a think about what it is specifically you really want to know, because that will then help you focus your investigations and get more out of it. If you want your project to tie into wider research, then it's worth having a look at your regional research framework. So this is something that archaeologists have produced across the country. There's one kind of for each region. So Worcestershire falls within the West Midlands. You can find them by just Googling Archaeological Research Framework. And they have kind of lists, usually by time period, of areas that archaeologists want to know more about. So under-researched areas that it would, there'd be greatest contributions if we'd know more about those. Sometimes if you're looking for inspiration and you're wanting to contribute to wider pieces of work, they can be useful places to start. So once you've set your aims, have a think about the scale of what you're planning to do. Does the investigation have several strands to it? Are there multiple locations or time periods perhaps that you're wanting to research? Or does it have distinct stages? So, for example, an identification stage, so you know where this site is, followed up by investigating that site. Now you know where it is. I know from experience that it can be really easy to come up with a project that is far bigger than kind of what you can actually achieve within the timeframes you're wanting. It's really good to think big, but it's often best to start small. So pick a starting point and somewhere kind of a manageable point that your project can start from. Once your aims are set and you've narrowed down a starting point, or perhaps two, and that's okay because you might change your mind as you find out a bit more information. The next step then is to gather all of the relevant information that you can find. You might already have quite a lot of information to hand, but there may still be some surprising details out there that you haven't seen before, so it is always worth doing a thorough check. This will mean that you have fewer surprises later on, and as well as helping you kind of make more sense of the results that you find. If you're thinking of investigating a specific time period, don't just stick to researching that era, as it can be valuable to know what went on both before and afterwards, particularly if your investigation is going to be focused around one particular site. Archaeologists tend to call this a kind of a desk-based assessment, so it's without going out into the field before you do that, everything you can find out in advance. And it's really useful because it sometimes flags up important details that will affect what you're doing later on. So if you look at 19th century maps, you might discover that they show small quarry pits in an area that's got earthworks in that you suspect is a medieval village and you want to investigate. That's important because then you can avoid those quarry pit areas because they'll have likely destroyed any earlier archaeology. Or you might find out that there's perhaps, say, prehistoric flint work has been found scattered across a field that you also think was, say, a mill site. And so you need to be aware if you're going to do work there, you might also come across other bits of archaeology. There's loads of sources of information out there, but some of the key ones are local information. So do you have a local history or archaeological society who have lots of information on the local area? Individuals as well, so particularly if it's going to be buildings focused, do people have local memories or photographs of an area? Second one is historic maps. This is always worth doing. The National Library of Scotland have very helpfully digitised most of the early edition Ordnance surveys for the country. So despite being the Library of Scotland, they have digitised most of Britain. The Ordnance surveys started in the 1880s, and generally the first kind of 3, 4, 5 editions are available free online. That's really useful because you can compare over those decades what appears, what disappears, and they're kind of a really useful starting point. Google Earth, which is also free, does have historic aerial photographs. So for some areas, not the whole of the country, but for some areas they have photographs from the 1940s. So if you're looking at anything like crop marks or earthworks, that might be a useful place to look to. The third place is your local record office, so the county archives. They're likely to hold earlier maps for an area you're looking at, so they might have parish, tithe or enclosure maps from the kind of earlier 19th century or possibly older ones. If you're looking at a particular building, they may hold records related to that building. If you're on land that's perhaps owned by an estate, that sort of thing, they might well have records that have been deposited there as well. So it's always worth doing a little bit of an investigation to find out more. And then finally, the last one is the Historic Environment Record. So this one isn't quite so well known, but it's a really, really valuable public resource. Each county maintains its own historic environment record, and it's a detailed database of all historic buildings, sites, and investigations, so archaeological excavations too, that happen. And these are all flagged up on a kind of a map system, which is called a geographical information system, that contains lots of layers. So as well as pinpointing, kind of flagging up reports from investigations, it contains aerial photographs of the area, historic maps, and also LiDAR images. So there's an example of a LiDAR image on the slide there in the middle. And this is when a plane flies over an area and sends points down and measures the time it takes them to come back up again. So you get a really detailed survey of the ground surface and the topography, but it can pick up earthworks, including below tree cover, which is really, really valuable. So the example on the left shows the area that's covered in trees, and actually what you can see is underneath the trees, there's lots and lots of earthworks, and there's actually a hill fort going on there, which you would struggle to see otherwise. So the Historic Environment Record is really well worth a good look. You'll be able to tell you about other archaeological work that's happened in the area. There's a version of it that you can access from home online called Heritage Gateway. You can put in kind of a search area and it'll give you some kind of top level information. What that doesn't have though is the full information or a map view. So if you're wanting detailed information, it's probably worth getting in touch with your local historic environment record for the county and asking them for more information. For a community project, they will almost certainly be able to provide a search for a kind of around an area of all their records for free. And you might be able to go in and view it somewhere. So if you find out details and get in touch with them, that's always worth doing. So now that you're well armed with information and you've got clear aims, it's time to think about how you're going to go about the investigation. There's lots of different archaeological methods to choose from, and all of them have their own kind of pros and cons. So it pays off to plan carefully before you just launch straight in. Broadly speaking, these techniques can be divided into two groups. One is intrusive archaeology, which involves disturbing below the ground, and the other is non-intrusive. So the non-intrusive methods include things like earthworks surveys, building recording, fieldwalking, and geophysical surveys. The intrusive can include auguring surveys, which we'll come to in a minute, archaeological test pits, and excavations. So this isn't a comprehensive list, and it's not meant to be, but it does cover the most common techniques that are used. I'm not going to go into details of these now, as we'll go through them all individually in a minute. So if there's anything you're not clear about or haven't heard of things before, we'll be covering them. Before we go through them in kind of individually, it's worth having kind of a reminder of some of the key considerations to bear in mind whilst you're thinking about which techniques to choose. These things will help you pick what's going to be most appropriate for you and your project. The first one is permissions. Do you need permission from the landowner or anyone else to do the piece of work you want to do? Do you have access to that site or to that building? Second is skills and equipment. What are you going to need to do this project? Have you done it before? Do you have the skills to do it? Can you find out that information? Or are you perhaps going to need some external guidance and support? What are the cost implications? Some things will cost a lot more than others. Where's that money going to come from? Can you get hold of that money via a grant or another route? Are there any safety considerations? The type, perhaps weather dependent as well, the times of the year when it might be more or less appropriate to do a piece of work, particularly if it involves kind of vegetation or where you're kind of near to watery, boggy areas. Another consideration is who's going to be involved. Is it going to be the local community? If so, will that involve families and children? Do a local school want to be involved? Any other groups? And then does that then have any knock-on implications for perhaps what kind of sort of days of the week, weekends you do your project, time of the year, any kind of cost implications or implications on perhaps the support you're going to need to do this project. And finally, the last one is timescales. So how long have you got, or kind of what time frame do you want to achieve this in? Are there any other kind of seasonal weather kind of considerations that you need to keep in mind? So first up, we've got earthworks surveys. So this is when you create a measured plan of an area that contains kind of strange lumps and bumps in the ground. It's a really good way to record and understand an area of earthworks, as the plan that you produce as part of the survey can then really help you to see the site in a different way and compare it to other sites. An earthworks survey can be carried out by quite a small team of people over just a couple of days. That's obviously dependent though on the size of area you're trying to survey and whether this is something you've done before. There are a lot of how-to guides out there. So an earthworks survey is something that anyone can have a go at. You don't need to have done it before, and it doesn't require that much specialist equipment. Although you will need long tape measures, so often kind of 30, 50 or 100 metre tapes, depending on the size of the area you're surveying. And ranging poles, so there's a kind of, usually they're red and white scales, poles painted in red and white sections, like you can see in the photograph. And these are really useful for making sure that your tape measure is actually straight. If you're setting out a tape measure line as a baseline, you need to know that it's a straight line, not just assume it's a straight line. And obviously kind of drawing and recording paper. So moving on now to building recordings. This is another method that doesn't require too much equipment. The aim of a building recording is usually to create a snapshot of a building as it is now and to understand a bit about its history. It usually involves photographic survey, creating a written description, and kind of doing sketch drawings of both the building's plan, so kind of what it looks like from above, and its kind of external walls. Historic England have a document where they've defined 4 different levels of building recording, from 1 being kind of a quite basic level survey, through to 4 being what they term as a comprehensive analytical record. You can find this online if you kind of Google Historic England building recording. And more detailed end, at kind of level 3, level 4, specialist knowledge of architecture is needed as it starts to get into kind of dating a building and understanding its various phases. This isn't necessarily needed though if the aim of what you're doing is to create a record for the future. That doesn't require any specialist knowledge, it just requires a kind of thorough survey of the building as it is now. And again, there's lots of how-to guides out there that kind of go through step by step the information you need to record and think about. The Historic England guidance that I mentioned a minute ago is a really useful starting point in the checklist of what you kind of might want to include in your project. But it's not necessarily aimed at community groups, and there may be guidance out there that is more suited to what you're trying to achieve. So on to fieldwalking. This can be really useful for identifying sites or activities that leave behind lots of artefacts. It involves setting out a grid across a ploughed field and carefully checking each grid square that you've set out for surface finds. By collecting all the finds up by each grid square, you're able to then pinpoint which parts of the field they came from. And then when you kind of plot these on a plan, you can start to see any patterns or pinpoint if there's clusters of finds in certain areas. That can then be really helpful for pinning down whether this area, and then within that area, where there might be a site. So if you've got, say, 3 different fields and you think that somewhere within that there's a site, this will help you pinpoint it down. It does again require fairly minimal equipment, long tape measures, find bags. Timing wise, this one can be a little bit harder to arrange as you do need a ploughed field. So that obviously requires kind of working quite closely on timings with the local farmer and landowner. Depending what your aims for this project are, you may also need find specialists to be able to identify and date the assemblage as well. There are artefact guides out there if you want to start doing this yourself. So for example, in Worcestershire, we have an online ceramics database that has photographs and descriptions for all of the ceramics for lots of different time periods that you find in the county, so that you can start to have a bit of a look yourself and work out what's been found. You may also have a local community archaeology group who have some expertise in this area and perhaps a pottery reference collection. There's also an organisation called the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and they record and identify stray finds and particularly metal detecting finds. They generally, though, won't record whole fieldwalking assemblages. But if you say, for instance, in the local area, there's 1 or 2 particularly interesting finds that someone's found whilst walking across the field, they will be able to tell you what those are and kind of record them and the date of them. If you're in need of precise dating and details from the artefacts you've found, if that's going to be important to your project, you will need to consider paying for archaeological finds analysis if that's something that as a group you're not going to have kind of the previous experience of yourself or kind of know another group who can kind of provide that information. So as so often featured on Time Team, geophysical surveys can provide us with really amazing images of what's below the ground. There's several different types of geophysical survey, and it depends on what you're trying to find and the local soils as to what's going to be most appropriate. As you'd expect, it requires very expensive and specialist equipment, as well as the software that you need to then kind of map the results. Geophysics don't always produce nice, clear pictures that are easy to interpret. It can be affected by ground kind of geological features and by modern disturbance. So sometimes archaeology doesn't show up very well, and sometimes not at all. So that is something you need to bear in mind and kind of seek advice about before launching in and kind of assuming that you'll be able to get the information you want from a geophysical survey. In Worcestershire, the South Worcestershire Archaeology Group, SWAG, have some survey equipment, and there are commercial companies out there as well who do this. And there is a company out there as well that specialises in surveys for community projects. And that might be kind of a route you want to go down if you want local people to be involved in actually carrying out the survey, not just seeing the results of it too. And so there are several options, and those organisations should all be able to offer a bit of advice as well about the survey that's going to be type of survey that's going to be most appropriate, and kind of any other considerations things you need to bear in mind. So I mentioned auguring on the list earlier, and I suspect some of you may have kind of wondered what that one was. This is a kind of a lesser known archaeological technique, but it is very useful for understanding what layers lie beneath the ground without having to dig a huge, great big hole. It involves pushing into the ground a narrow metal tube, as you can see in the pictures, and then bringing back up a kind of thin core of sediments. So these are recorded, and then you're able to see at what depth the soil changes and how it changes. This is especially useful in cases where you suspect or know you're going to have very deep layers beneath the ground, so such as how deep an old pond or perhaps a moat is, if you're near to a river or stream and are wondering if that historically and recently there's been lots of alluvium and kind of sediment deposited over the area. That can be useful as well to kind of work out how deeply buried other bits of archaeology might be. Augers are specialist pieces of equipment, and there are several different types of them as well. But most commercial archaeology companies will have one, as well as university archaeology departments. So you may be able to hire one from either of those places. If the environmental analysis of the sediments you come across is going to be useful for the project too, then you're going to have to budget in for an environmental archaeologist for their time as well, to give some advice and to kind of give you some answers about what's there. So now we're starting to get into some of the most popular techniques, although these are getting more towards the expensive end. So test pits are small 1 by 1 metre squares that are often dug in 10 centimetre layers so that the finds can be separated out by the depth. So this means that this kind of way of digging test pits means that no previous experience or specialist knowledge is required, so that anyone can get involved in digging a test pit. As they're really small, you can also put them kind of practically anywhere, including tree cover, where, if you've got an area of woodland, it might be that the roots prevent a larger excavation, but you can put a test pit in. If you've got kind of a lost site that you're trying to pinpoint the location down, test pits can be an initial kind of useful initial check for testing those areas and spreading them out over a wide area or several different sites to narrow down the search. The test pits in themselves may tell you everything you need to know, or you may want to follow them up with a larger excavation once you've kind of narrowed that area down. Another way that test pits are sometimes used is in a settlement, particularly villages, to understand the origins and development of that place over time. So they work by using the pottery from those test pits as a kind of proxy indicator for occupation. So if you've got more pottery, the idea is that there was more occupation in the past, because historically people threw their rubbish kind of out the back of houses. One test pit in itself doesn't tell you an enormous amount, But if you start to have 10, 20, 30 across the settlement, that starts to build up a kind of mosaic picture of what was going on over time. You can start to see if a settlement shifted or kind of contracted and changed over time. Again, there are quite a lot of step-by-step guides out there, but archaeological support, so either from a commercial company or a community archaeology group that has kind of experience, is advised to help understand what's encountered and to analyse any finds you come across. Equipment-wise, you need obviously digging equipment, excavation equipment. A lot of that is kind of common garden equipment, so buckets, spades, shovels. But you will also need a little bit of specialist equipment as well. So often mattocks can be quite useful depending where you're digging. Long tape measures sometimes are needed to plan in where your excavation and test pits are, or a GPS survey, and again finds bags and things like that. So there's kind of more equipment is needed as we start getting towards excavation, because there's also drawing and recording equipment as well. So finally, we've been on to the thing that everyone's probably been waiting for, which is excavation. Sometimes the only way to answer the questions you've got is to dig and find out what's below the ground. An excavation might involve one large area or several trenches. As excavation and digging itself is a destructive process, it's really, really important that excavations are well recorded, with photographs, drawings, and written descriptions of what you encounter. You also need to make sure that the excavation area itself is well located, so either by hand planning it in with kind of long tapes and tying it into features that are recorded on maps, so boundaries that aren't going to move, or by having something like a GPS survey that can pinpoint all the corners in. Anyone can take part in an excavation, but there do need to be a few people involved in the dig who are confident at recognising and recording archaeology. These could be professional archaeologists, but it doesn't have to be. It just needs to be someone who has considerable experience of field work, and you may find that a local archaeology kind of group or society has members who have done quite a lot of field work before. Also need to ensure that whoever's going to kind of support you with the excavation is involved in the planning stages, because they'll be able to advise about how big an area can feasibly be excavated within a certain time frame, advice about locating trenches, safety issues, costs, and kind of other things to consider. As well as planning in advance of field work, it's important to remember that archaeology doesn't stop once field work finishes. Post-excavation work is an integral part of any archaeological project, and I know despite the name, it does apply to any research project, not just excavations. It's about really taking a step back, looking at what you found and working out whether further information is needed, so parallels to other sites, for example, or analysis, and then piecing those details together and writing up the results. If you've collected artefacts as part of the project, these will need to be washed and analysed and then kind of carefully labelled and sorted. All projects are going to generate some sort of records, so drawings and photographs and kind of written sheets. And all of these, together with the artefacts you found, form the project archive. You're going to need to decide, and it's best to often do this at the outset when you're planning the project, what's going to happen to this archive, to where will it go in the long term. Artefacts legally belong to the landowner unless they're declared as treasure, and there is a legal definition for that. Most artefacts obviously don't fall in that category. So because they belong to the landowner, if they're going to go elsewhere, you need permission from the landowner before that happens. It's considered best practice within archaeology to deposit an archive with your kind of nearest collecting museum, and that's usually the county museum. So it might not be your nearest local museum, but the kind of main one in the county. At the moment, though, museums are struggling with storage space, and they do often charge a deposition fee for the boxes you deposit with them, and some of them are closed as well to new collections. So it's worth getting in touch with them and just talking about what you're wanting to do, and because they'll be able to give you kind of the best advice for ensuring that the archive is preserved and accessible for the future. So that's a really important step not to miss out, because you need that archive to be there for the future. Another thing to consider at the outset when you're planning your project is how you're going to share these results. So you've done the project, you should be very proud of what you've achieved, but who else is going to know about it and how? So a written report is going to be essential for recording what you've done, why, where, and what you found, so that other people, both now, other archaeological groups and professionals, know, and in the future, and they'll be able to see what you've done. So there's a couple of key places to send a copy of any project report. One is to the Historic Environment Record, which we mentioned earlier, so that's for your county. They keep a copy of all records like this. And the other is the Archaeology Data Service. They're online, and they are maintaining a database of all archaeological work in the UK. And that's a really good place to go to find information kind of in your local area, but also for storing your reports so other people can find out about it. ADS are also an accredited digital archive. They're the only one in the UK. So the kind of documentary paper and digital part of your archive can be stored with them. So scans of record sheets, drawings and photographs. So that might be a route you want to consider as well. And then on a more local level, it's worth having a think about sharing your project with the local community and any other groups who've been involved. So it might be, kind of as shown in the picture on the photograph, you might want to have open days, perhaps talks later on, or school visits and fine displays. Maybe that the results of the investigation are going to feed into perhaps a piece of local artwork. We've been involved in a project before where a mosaic was created at the local school out of lots of the bits of pottery that were found that weren't going to the archive. So there's going to be no right or wrong way to do this. It's just what works best for you and the groups that you're sharing the project with. There's lots of guidance and sort of how-to step-by-step guides out there, kind of, as I already mentioned. It can be hard to know where to start looking though. So on our Explore the Past website, we have several guides that are up there that you can just download. So we have one on building recording, earthworks surveys, and the post-excavation work. And they include equipment lists and kind of template documents that you can use. One of the biggest collections of guides out there is on the ISGAP website. So that stands for Introduction to Standards and Guidance in Archaeological Practice. I know that's not the most catchy, but they do have the biggest kind of repository of guides out there for archaeology. They've got a guide on almost anything, and a lot of them have been written with community projects in mind. The website itself is a little kind of outdated now and is due a revamp, but it is still a really useful place to look. You will find as well guides produced by various other archaeological organisations. There's quite a few on the Jigsaw Project website, which is over in Cambridgeshire, and West Yorkshire Joint Archaeological Services have quite a few as well. It's always good to find out who your local archaeological unit is, as they're likely to be quite a good source of advice and support, and they may be able to kind of loan you or hire you equipment as well. If you're not sure where your nearest archaeological unit is, who they are, you can search through onto the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, CIFA, and they have a list of registered organisations. If you Google that, you'll be able to come up with their search bar and you can kind of put in your area and it brings up a map of everyone near to you. Most archaeological companies cover quite a wide area, so if you haven't got one, within a 15-minute drive away, then don't worry. We're Worcestershire Archive and Archaeology Service, but we do work outside of Worcestershire as well, so we work in neighbouring counties of Warwickshire, Herefordshire, Shropshire, Gloucestershire, and we sometimes work further afield as well, and that's very common for most archaeological units to work in that sort of kind of wider area. As with all projects, there are costs associated with archaeology. These may be fairly minimal if you don't need much equipment and you're not going to have to pay anyone, but costs can quite quickly add up. And that might leave you then wondering where all this funding is going to come from. If it's more than your group can fund, or the project's going to be a standalone and doesn't have a group behind it, then you can apply for a grant or perhaps go down the crowdfunding and kind of traditional fundraising route of collecting donations. And you can do a bit of both. Funding bodies change quite a lot over time, so it's always worth kind of searching around to see what there is now. One of the largest and most popular funds for archaeological projects is the National Lottery Heritage Fund. But you may also be eligible for funds from specific community heritage grants. So in the past there has been the Mick Aston Archaeology Fund, specialist heritage organisations, so if you're focusing on a particular time period, such as Roman or medieval archaeology, there may be a fund out there for that. And then within your local area, you may find that the local council or perhaps a civic society has grants for community projects. So have a bit of a look around and just don't be afraid to have a go and apply for funding. This talk isn't to go into details and tips for that now, but if you're wanting advice on that, there is information out there, including another of our YouTube talks that we kind of went into detail on this specific topic. So have a look for that if you are wanting more information on funding. So, in summary, key points for investigating your local archaeology. So remember that preparations do make all the difference. Take time to properly plan the project and think it all through, including all the stages, before you start, and then where needed, seek advice. Think big, but start small, so make sure you have a clear focus and your project can be realistically achieved within the time you'd like. Don't be afraid to ask for advice or support. There will be people out there who are happy to help, and there'll be information and guidance out there, because you won't be the only ones, I can guarantee, who have those questions. And finally, make sure that the project is recorded and shared so that others can appreciate and build on what you've done. And you can also be proud of what you've achieved. Please do get in touch with us if you have any questions or a specific project in mind that you'd like to chat through. You can email us at explorethepast@worcestershire.gov.uk. You can get in touch via various social media channels or our website, which is explorethepast.co.uk. And thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this talk useful, and we look forward to hearing about any future projects that go on. Thanks very much.